Well, tonight we're going to talk about Noah's flood and the timeline that leads up to it. Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Geer, as well. This is one of my favorite topics as we've gone over, we've done shows on this before, but we're concentrating today on the patriarchs that surround the flood event, which is interesting, I think, because the three major traditions that we have are in primary agreement, which is interesting, because they diverge quite significantly before and after the flood. So I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, we were talking about this in our church service this month because it was he talked about the genealogy of Christ and the people in the genealogy that led up to the birth of Christ. Pastor actually did an interesting sermon. He talked about all the women that were in that genealogy, Tamar and Ruth
Yes.
and Bathsheba and a lot of these people that were in the genealogy weren't that decent of people, and so we it was kind of an interesting way to look at things, and so I think that the genealogy in that is listed in the Bible in several different places is very important to God because it shows that this world actually is not that old, not millions of years old, and that's
Well, yeah, just speaking of that, for those even Christians, they think, well, these are these earlier people, especially unbelievers, if they were real at all, they're more metaphor, they're more allegorical people, not real people. And I said, well, when did the ancestors of Jesus go from real people to fake people? Because Luke has a genealogy that goes directly from Jesus all the way back to Adam. There's a significant reason for that the case. As we know in creation circles, we call the first Adam, and Jesus is the last Adam from biblical ideas. He's the one that undid the effect that Adam brought onto the earth, which we are still suffering under in a physical sense. But spiritually, we've been set free by the first advent of this last Adam, Jesus Christ. So that's the thing that right now you get responses from people who don't believe in the chronology, and even a lot of biblical commentators for a long time didn't really take a lot of the genealogical or chronological information all that seriously, but it was taken very seriously for many, many, many centuries up until probably I'd say the 19th century, So
yeah, you have had people like Archbishop Usher who did a phenomenal work in
he did.
documenting the chronology in the Bible. Isaac Newton did quite a work in
Yes, he did.
documenting the chronology of the Bible. A lot of other people like Lightfoot and Morrow and these people that you've studied.
Well, yeah, Martin Anstey. In recent times, you have David Downs with the Egyptology, and you have Floyd Jones has done yeoman's work. All of them have something to add, and all of them don't totally agree with each other. There's enough stuff in the biblical record to leave room to try to say, all right, what about this? What about this? And that's fair. Those are all fair observations, but none of these observations from and all the chronologers there. Jones gives a list of all the chronologers, Scaliger, I mean everybody, Augustine, and all the church fathers. None of them give you a long age scenario. This never came into existence till Darwin. Well, Lyell and then Hutton, Lyell and Darwin later on. We never had long ages in the Christian world. We had them in the pagan world. And that's an interesting thing when we talk about that, because when we want to compare two of the major chronologicals or chronologies from Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11 are the primary ones we're dealing with. You're dealing, there's three major traditions, but one of them people hardly know much about them, and it's got a lot of variance in it. I think it doesn't really lend itself to tremendous authoritative street cred, if you will. But it's got some good things to it, despite that, and it has a lot of agreements, surprisingly, with more with the Septuagint, and that's the whole thing. Which you have the Masoretic text and the Septuagint.
Explain
Go
those
ahead.
two texts,
I'm
what
gonna
they
I'm,
are.
I'm gonna explain that. Okay, the Septuagint was created from by Alexandrian Jews. This is what we the best information. The mythological, but there's some veracity to it. We don't know how much, but supposedly 72 Jewish scholars came in, and then they were going to translate the from the original Hebrew into the Greek, which was becoming the language of the day. And so, and because as the Hebrew language is getting lost, they didn't want to lose the scriptures. So that was about 281 BC. That version, by the way, was the only version really used, or it was the primary one, significantly by all the early church, pretty much for the first 1,000 years of the church. There was a few exceptions. I think Jerome might have favored the Masoretic text, but most everyone enjoyed or believed in this that the Septuagint was authoritative. And the early church fathers, that seems to be what they used. Okay, was the Septuagint. So that was translated by Alexandrian Jews to about almost 300 BC. Okay, 300 years. The Masoretic text came into existence about in the second century AD. Well, it really wasn't the Masoretic text. That's really the ninth century when you really become the Masoretic text. But it was the rabbinical tradition, if you want to put it that way, after the fall of Jerusalem in the first century, and then they wanted to consolidate the scriptures, and so they wanted to get an authoritative version that didn't suffer some of the problems that said the Septuagint had. When Septuagint went out to a lot of areas, over time you can get scribal errors, you can get certain things, and they're easily ferreted out, and it's not hard to figure out what things might have been misplaced or whatever. Some are a little more difficult. We'll get into that when we talk about the flood thing. But so the Masoretic text that started with the rabbinical, in the second century AD, and then by the time of the Masoretes, they really were very consistent. And the advantage of the Masoretic text is it was a consistent text that went to all the synagogues and places of worship after the diaspora. Okay, does that mean, which was 70 AD after the Romans came in and conquered Jerusalem? Jews were scattered all over the world, and so they wanted an authoritative thing. And the advantage of it, of course, is that you have a consistent translation that went everywhere. The disadvantage of the Masoretic text is if you have an error, that also gets translated throughout the entire diaspora. The Septuagint, conversely, doesn't have the stricture, doesn't have the consistency. It's pretty consistent, but it can have things from Alexandria to Persia to Israel, to Egypt, all these different things. Over time, certain variants can come in, and so that gives people to maybe question it a little bit. But the early church, apparently, as far as we can tell, and from the apostles all the way down to till really almost the Reformation, the Septuagint was really the non rigor, if you will. It was the text that was the preferred text. But after the Reformation, the Masoretic text became the text, the primary text. Now that's a simplistic breakdown. It's a little more nuanced than that, but that's pretty much what it was.
I'm going to share my screen, and I've got
Okay,
your timelines here of both the Septuagint and Masoretic texts,
good.
yeah, from my book here. So let's take a look at that. The different chronologies of uh, from the age of the earth, and then the BC date. So if you take a look at Adam, which is the first man created. He lived 130 years before Seth was born, and then Seth lived 105 years when Enos was born. Enos begat Canaan, and after 90 years, Canaan was 70 when Mahalalel was born. Mahalalel was 65 when Jared was born. Jared was 163 when Enoch was born. Enoch was 65 when Methuselah was born. Methuselah was 187 when Lamech was born. Lamech was 182 when Noah was born. And so then you have Noah was 502 when Shem was born, and then the flood took place at 1656 years after the creation, which would be 2348 BC. Comparing that with Septuagint, Rich, why don't
Yeah.
you explain to us how the Septuagint is different?
Okay, what you look at it, pretty straightforward. It looks like either the Masoretic text deducted 100 years off, or the Septuagint added 100 years. Because instead of 130 for Adam, it was 230 for Adam when Seth was born. Okay, and instead of 105 when Enos was born, then you have 205 when Enos was born in the Septuagint. And this is pretty consistent all the way down to the time of the flood. And that's what's interesting, because at the time of the flood, the dates pretty much are the same. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because there's an interlocking consistency about when the flood happened and the births of these patriarchs, that if you kind of play fast and loose with the timelines, you're going to have problems. And now, so the argument is has been, well, and it came out apparently only in the 19th century. I didn't realize it was that late. I thought, because I all my whole life I'd heard what they call the inflationary hypothesis, is that the Septuagint added 100 years to the begetting age of the next descendant, added 100 years to try to make their genealogies more in line with Egyptian chronology. But I even back then I thought that was a little lame. I thought, well, why didn't they add 1,000 years or 500? I mean, because, and even if they added just two or 300 years more, it would have been much more consistent, because Egyptology goes back into, like, it goes back thousands of years earlier than even the Septuagint chronology allows. It just wouldn't allow for that. So you got to say somebody added or subtracted it, or somebody misprinted it, but it's a consistent change all the way down. So it's not, it has to be intentional. There really can't be an accident. You can have an accidental scribal error from one or another one down the road, but a consistent change like that speaks to say, well, why would that be? Why would that happen? And so the inflationary hypothesis was the idea that they were trying to match chronologies around the specifically Egypt chronology, but even the Persian chronologies, the Babylonian, the Chinese, probably all those go back thousands, millennia of time earlier. Okay,
Not only
so
that, but the Hindu chronology goes back even further
yeah,
than
it goes back hundreds. Yeah,
what the geologists would even dare to speculate. So,
I know yeah. So that's a real big problem, and as I said, I sort of smiled when I started getting more favorable to the Septuagint understanding of the chronology, because the apostles used it, and the early church all favored it, and I thought, even with the possibility of scribal errors, it seems to be, at least in this part, the chronology seems to be has a lot more in its favor than the shortened chronology. One of those things is there's a scripture where it talks about Abraham, who died at 175 years of age, an old man full of years. But if I read this article, it's interesting. They talk about, but if he was an old man, you still had. There's several reasons why. Uh, I'll just go down why I favor the Septuagint, and I agree with the arguments. The inflation hypothesis fail in part or in whole on 8 major points. They cannot explain the matching begetting age in the Samaritan Pentateuch, which that's that third tradition, and the 70 of Genesis 11, which would need to arise separately and independently. See, the problem is they tell you that these Alexandrian Jews tried to inflate it, that they tried to blame the translators. But earlier traditions, I didn't get into that at all. There's at least 4 or 5 witnesses in the second or first to third century BC, and they're secular, so you can't use that as authoritative witness. But all of them don't work at all with a shortened chronology. They only work with a long chronology, every one of them. And they predate the Masoretic tradition or the rabbinical tradition by 400, 500 years. So this is something you gotta deal with. Okay. There are no ancient testimonies to support the shortened chronology, okay, and to support the inflationary hypothesis. It would have been impossible for the 70 translators or anyone else to get away with such a fraud due to the subsequent dissemination of the 70 throughout the diaspora. And that's the thing. In the first century, it was going out all over the place. Jewish communities embraced and used the 70 for several centuries before the advent of the church. A falsely inflated primeval chronology would have been quickly exposed as fraudulent. So it goes through a lot of listings, but I think, and I said earlier, the Septuagint's chronology fails to equal or surpass ancient versions of Egyptian chronology. And the rest of the part is the none of the rest of the Septuagint conforms to Egyptian influence at all. Okay, so why would this be the only thing? A lot of authors are saying that these translators were actually utilizing what's called the vorlage, which is the Hebrew, original Hebrew, to make their translation. It wasn't the translators trying to change it. And that then you got to say, well, then did the Masoretes or the rabbinical do that? And that's an argument we've talked about before. There's an argument why they may have wanted to do that. But as I said earlier, back to Abraham time, I kind of jumped around a little bit, I apologize, that Abraham, an old man full of years, makes no sense when you got 300, 400, and 600-year-old people still alive. Noah would have died less than 50 years before Abraham was born. Shem would have still been alive. Arphaxad would still been alive. And these people were much older than Abraham. It'd be like you and I telling me that a 35-year-old man died an old man full of years. But with the Septuagint chronology, Noah was dead for almost a millennium. Okay, it's a little bit more. This does not help long ages at all because you're talking instead of, let's say, 4004 with Bishop Usher, Archbishop Usher, to maybe 4046, which is the more popular theory or age is used today, to maybe 5200. What's yeah, it was a 52, yeah,
5326 BC would have been the date of
5326. Yep.
creation.
Yeah. And
And
now
then
that
the Noah's flood would have been at the 3070 BC.
Right. Yeah. So you have I always thought it was very interesting. This was a speculative and what you would call an intuitive. I thought of myself that, even I think Answers in Genesis does a wonderful job of explaining how all this could have happened. And they could be right for all I know. The Masoretic may be the right one, but it just doesn't. I always had misgivings about how developed civilizations seemed to be in the time of Abraham. Well, this would have been just a couple hundred years after the Tower of Babel, you know? I
Hmm.
mean, it would have, you know what I'm saying? It just seemed it could happen. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, that it's impossible, but it stretches a little bit of my credibility a bit. Where when you have a millennium, they're described like these civilizations are well developed at this time. The other part, but the idea of Abraham, an old man full of years, is actually in the Masoretic text. Henry B. Smith is who I took a lot of this information from, and there's other articles as well. He thinks might have been a mistake on their part leaving it in because it reveals that their chronology was flawed, and so that's a big problem. But interestingly enough, to the gist of the show is why all of a sudden that's something that got me is why suddenly around Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, and Shem, the ages are all the same. And
Yeah.
that's because there's an interlocking event called the flood that happens.
Hmm.
And Noah's birth begetting age for Shem is 502 years, is 502 years old. You go, what the heck? It jumps from like you got these earlier 900-year-old patriarchs, and they're having people at 29 years of age and 30 years. It's possible. None of that is not possible. But why would suddenly that one jump that much? And then Methuselah was high, Lamech was high, and even though Lamech died a couple hundred years earlier, which I speculate. I wonder if that was the beginning of a bottleneck for some of our genetic breakdown, that something happened in Lamech that got transmitted down to the later descendants. Didn't translate to Noah per se, but it revealed itself later on. That's a sidebar. But I think it's very fascinating that that interlocking flood time, those begetting ages are and the remaining years, how long they actually lived, are all the same. Now there was a little bit of a Septuagint issue that I. This is the thing that I remember kind of disparaging a little Ann Habermill back in the day because she was a big Septuagint fan back in the day. And I thought the real argument against it was that Methuselah outlived the flood by 14 years. And that's based on our version of the Maser of the Septuagint, which has Methuselah begetting Lamech at 167 years of age instead of 187. Unbeknownst to me, and Henry B. Smith, he brings it out that Jerome and Augustine actually make mention that that this was a variant and a mistake. And we don't have the variant, the good one that they had. We have only the scribal error one apparently, that's come down to us all these years. But they had one that's had the 187.
Mhm.
So I said, okay, that explains that. So I think that pretty much to me said, okay, that was the big argument for me to reject the Septuagint text, because of that. That was the main one. The
Well,
other
you
sidebar,
haven't rejected the Septuagint.
I mean,
You
I'm saying that's what I had originally when I had rejected it.
oh, all right, all right, okay.
Yeah, back in the day, I had rejected it. Since I learned this inflationary hypothesis and the Methuselah outliving the flood way back, I took a class called New Testament 222. We used to euphemistically call it Heresy 222 because they tried to teach you how nobody wrote what they said they wrote, and it was all written much later than the fact. You know, all the spurious things that to basically put big doubts upon the veracity of Scripture. That didn't play for me, but the idea of the Septuagint being flawed, and there is no doubt, and there's no truth and free full disclosure that the Septuagint there's been scribal errors, but there has been those in virtually every version of the Bible we have. God has preserved His Word, and it's very easy to find any scholarly research you can find the real scriptures. It's not like this version is the only one that can be. It's like people would say, well, if the King James Bible was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. We used to laugh about people say that. Well, some people think the same way with the Masoretic text, and I realized no, God preserves His Word and keeps it well, but there are things we have to study to show ourselves approved. But the flood is interesting because in all three traditions, the begetting ages, the lifespans, they're all pretty much interlocked. They
And,
don't
and
vary.
so the upshot of this is that we have a clear genealogy from Adam to Christ.
We do.
Yeah, and it is something that will not fit the millions of years of uniformitarian geology.
Yeah,
And
absolutely not.
then we can use the flood as an explanation for the geologic record in that we find in the rocks. And
Good. Yeah,
that's the
very good.
subject of my book, Don't Let Your Geology Mess Up Your Theology. And that's where we have this chronology that Rich has put together, and we have published that. And so what I'd like to do is to just sort of reprise what actually happened during the flood. We had the sort of the beginnings of the flood where a lot of the fountains of the deep were broken up, and which provided most of the water that flooded the earth. And there was a splitting of the continents and a rapid movement of the continents away from each other during the flood, rather than only a few inches at a time,
Yeah,
which
continental sprint,
affected
right?
continental sprint, yes. And there's the hydroplate model, which postulates that there was a underground system of water chambers that busted up. And then the hydroplate theory has also been, there's other theories called the catastrophic plate tectonics, which John Baumgartner is a proponent of. And that's where you have the plates sliding over and top of each other and subducting underneath, and it's actually the subduction that provides a mechanism for the movement of the continents. Then during the flood, you have the continuous buildup of sediment in vast layers of rock that spread out all over the world. It isn't just in localized areas. We can't talk about a local flood because you have evidence that you have billions of dead things buried in rock layers all over the earth, and that's what you find. And so, and then you find marine sediments throughout the fossil record from bottom to top. And you find the marine sediments buried with the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs sort of all in their one little area, but and you have to understand that the chronology of the secular geologic record is based upon the layers of rock that has fossils in them, and if the and it's a circular reason. If you find dinosaurs in a layer of rock, well, this is between 75 and 125 million years ago. And how do you know that? Well, it's because the dinosaurs died out 175 to 125 million years ago. And so it's something that's not measured. You have to understand that if you have sediments burying things um, quickly, that's how fossilization occurs. And you don't have fossilization occurring naturally today. Dead skunk on the side of the road just deteriorates altogether, even including the bones. They just disintegrate, and unless something is buried quickly, you don't have it fossilized. We find fossils buried throughout the world and the rock layers, and usually it's the hard parts and the clams and everything that makes up the rock layers. You have then when the water started to recede from the earth, you had it receding in sheets first, and then you have it channelizing, so it carves out the canyons. And finally, after the flood, as world was drying out after the flood, you have warm oceans producing uh, convection currents at the poles that pile up snow on the continents. And so at the edges of the waters, which have been warm, you would have had still some temperate environments where you had the creatures living after the flood for a while, but the snow would have been piled up into the interiors. And that's what you find. You find, in the Arctic, there's a lot of large fossil beds of mammoths and mastodons, and in fact, a lot of the ivory that was collected up there ended up being part of the flood. Well, Rich, I'm afraid that we're out of time.
Yeah, that went fast, didn't it?
Yeah, so we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.